All right, everyone, welcome to week 4. Let's see, what do we have in store this week? We are going for sustainable growth. All right, so as usual, I'm going to do a little review of last week's content and then talk about this week's stuff. All right, so last week we did the market society, and we talked about neoliberal economics and how Adam Smith, who is considered basically the father of neoliberal economics, when he wrote The Wealth of Nations and proposed this idea of the invisible hand, which, if you remember, is the idea that if we act in our own self-interest, we'll benefit society more than if we try to purposefully benefit. So this is neoliberals love this concept because it allows their philosophy, right? So it's really every person for themselves in this economy, and magically it'll make everything better for everyone. As we discussed, there is some truth to that, but there's a lot that's not true about that, especially in terms of sustainability, and we'll get into a lot of these as we move forward. But um, one of the really big problems with this is the concept of externalities, which we also talked about, which, if you remember, is the impact of a transaction that happens to someone outside of that transaction. So basically, someone that had no choice in the matter gets impacted, either positively or negatively. Most often, we're worried about negative externalities like pollution, which we talked about a lot. So I'm not going to go over that again, but super important concept in sustainability and the the I guess the genesis of that problem is that it's if something doesn't count in a market, right? So if something doesn't isn't reflected in the price, that thing will be ignored because markets are great at managing resources that have a price. There's some other specifics that must be um, sort of preconditions that must be met in order for markets to work properly. Like you have to know where the damage is coming from. It has to be something that's measurable. It has to be something that's happening, now. So there's a lot of issues with it. But externalities are one of those fundamental things that they're just invisible to the market. And so when that happens, that was something we call market failure, if you remember, is when something is not included in the price of the market, or specifically when the social cost is greater than the private cost. So when the cost to society is greater than the cost to the individual making that decision, that's a market failure because the market fails to appropriately account for all the costs. So this is a really big issue. We talked about a couple of examples, climate change being primary among them, big externality basically because the price of emitting CO2 or the cost of emitting CO2 is not fully integrated into the price. And that's a really big problem. So the market is terrible, absolutely terrible at managing things like that. It actually can't manage things like that unless you force it to by integrating things such as the social cost of carbon, which we talked about, right? So if you can internalize those externalities, then the market signal is properly sent, or at least an attempt to properly send the signal is there, and then the market can possibly deal with it. But without those signals, it's just not going to work. And we're reaching a point where a lot of these externalities are becoming so very important in terms of sustainability that we just really have to start internalizing them if we are going to address these really big problems like climate change, like biodiversity loss, like some aspects with environmental and social justice, with some aspects of water scarcity and so forth. Um, and so the market, as we did discuss, works really, really well for certain things. But from a sustainability perspective, there's a lot of issues with this neoliberal philosophy. And we talked about the case study of e-waste, which is electronic waste, which, if you remember, there's all these really toxic chemicals that often get shipped over to countries where people take it apart by hand. It can poison the soil, poison the water, it can poison them. But none of those impacts are integrated into the price of the electronics. So that's a market failure and a really big sustainability problem. Again, if you remember back to the first couple of weeks, we have to look at these issues through the lens of the three E's. Number one, first of all, can we keep doing it for the indefinite future? And then does it meet environmental equity and economic goals? And e-waste really kind of meets none of those because the environmental issue, the social equity issue is definitely a problem. And then in terms of the economy, remember that's about establishing a good, fair, just economy, which shipping toxic materials over to low-income countries does not facilitate a high quality of life for those people. So fails. And then finally, we talked about the tragedy of the commons, which remember is very specific. Um, and that's basically if you have open access resources. Um, so if nobody's managing a resource, uh, the um, the rational the rational person, again acting on their own self-interest, a la the invisible hand philosophy, a la neoliberal philosophy. If we act on our own self-interest, the problem is the rational person will just keep using more and more and more of that resource because I that person, let's say it's me, I get all the benefits, but I split the drawbacks with everybody else that's sharing the resource. And so inevitably, the tragedy is, and remember, tragedy is something that's inevitably going to happen. The tragedy is that resource will be overused, it'll be overproduced, it'll eventually collapse. Again, climate change is a tragedy of the commons problem because you could think of the atmospheric commons where nobody owns the atmosphere. And so if nobody's managing that atmosphere and saying like you can't emit this much carbon, you can't emit that much carbon, and so forth, um, then that becomes a tragedy of the commons problem. And we are reaching that point where it could end up in some kind of a collapse. Okay, so that's a quick overview. And now I'm going to go over to, or excuse me, review. And then this week, um, I'll go over into the week 4 review. Okay, so this is all about sustainable growth or the concept of sustainable growth. And so we're going to go over a couple of, again, really, really important fundamental concepts. Number one is the steady state economy. So again, this is an economic concept, but you don't have to have, be studying or have a degree in economics to understand this. And so the one of the primary ways that the economy is measured, and you'll hear this all the time if you're paying attention, is GDP. We talk about GDP a lot, gross domestic product, which is the value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's border over a specific time period. You can read through this. I'm not going to get over this a whole lot of detail, but basically GDP is a way to measure the total economic output of a country. Now, there's some issues with this because a lot of things are hidden from GDP, like black market activity, like bartering, like free labor provided by people, and so forth. In addition, GDP is only finished goods and services, so reused. So Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, none of that counts toward GDP. Okay, so it has to be new goods. So it is what it is. That's GDP. So we use that a lot, but there's a lot of issues with this in terms of the full accounting of like what's a country's economic output, but also what's good for society. So we're going to first start with this concept of the steady state economy. And there's a talk from Dan O'Neill where he goes over a lot of these issues related to this. And so one of the things that is almost like people don't even question, very, very few people question the belief that we need to keep growing the economy. That growth is good, period. No ifs, ands, or buts, no caveats. Growth is good. We want to grow. We want to keep growing. If you're a business, you want to keep growing. If you're an economy, you want to keep growing. So there's this sort of fundamental assumption that when the economy grows, it's just good. It's good for everyone. It's what we really need. And you can think of this on a personal level, okay? So your personal economics as well. Um, and I want you to really, really think about this. Um, is what is the actual amount of money important, or or is it important what that money does for you? And it may kind of seem like the same thing, but it's often not. Because ultimately, what we really care about is can we do the things that we feel will provide a high quality of life for us, for our family, whatever we care about for the rest, whatever. I mean, whatever your goals are. I mean, really the goal is the things that money can often provide, but it's not necessarily money. If you can get all these things, high quality of life, safe neighborhoods, the food, good food, a roof over your head, the ability to take a vacation, the ability to have, spend time with your family, be satisfied with your work, all on and on and on. Those are the real goals of the economy. It, if it is not necessarily just money. And so if we can achieve those things without growing the economy, then really what's the difference? It doesn't actually matter because the goal, again, is to get those things that money can usually get for us. But it's not, the data are really clear that more money does not always mean more of those things. It does not always mean more happiness, does not always mean a higher quality of life and so forth. It's sort of like you need a certain amount. Again, this is based on the data. You need a certain minimum amount. And then beyond that, yeah, maybe it can buy you a little more happiness here and there, more life satisfaction. You can afford better things that maybe help. But it's definitely not a one-to-one relationship past a certain point. And so that begs the question, should that be what we're um, trying to achieve in the economy? Should we just try to go to the economy or should we actually measure things that um, we really care about and then see how we achieve those things? All right, so from a sustainability perspective, I want you to really think, what should our goals be for a good economy? We've already talked about a lot of them. Okay, and so that's really the fundamental belief of the steady state economy is that really we're trying to achieve the wrong things. What we really should be measuring are all of these things that really matter: high quality of life for as many people as possible, and, environmental sustainability, and the ability to provide a good life for future generations, so current and future generations. So all these things we've talked about, those should really be the goals of an economy. And so the steady state economy proposes that's that what we should really pursue, and then let the other chips, the economic chips, fall where they may. Okay, so that's the concept of the steady state economy. I think Dan O'Neill brings up a lot of really good points there. And then we'll just a brief video about this economics and the environment and sort of the way that the environment treats, or excuse me, economics treats the environment. We've talked about this already with Herman Daly. Or no, we haven't talked about Herman Daly. That's this week. Sorry. Got ahead of myself. So William Rees, who's actually one of the fathers of the ecological footprint concepts, he talks about how the fact that nature is just invisible. There's no inherent value to nature in the economy, and this is a cause for concern. And then finally, we go over this sustainable growth, the concept of sustainable growth, which is this is a phrase that you'll continue to hear out there. But again, this is one of those things like, is first of all, is this even possible? Is this an oxymoron? And I'll let you think about why it might be. And then you read this article from Herman Daly, which is just one of my favorite articles that I've ever read. It's pretty short, but it's pretty dense. Um, and so Herman Daly's are really kind of famous in this field, but he brings up some really fascinating points in here about sustainable growth and what should the goals of an economy actually be. And again, that's really what we should be trying to achieve. For all of those that are living in poverty, we need to get them out of poverty. That's goal number one. Goal number two is like we need to live within our ecological limits. And then we want to also just in general provide the highest quality of life for the most people. So that should be the true goals. Those should be the true goals of an economy. And again, the economic growth side of things, we can kind of let those chips fall wherever they are, but as long as we're achieving those other goals. All right, so that's kind of an overview this week. It's a really, I think, an interesting lesson. This is one of the lessons that people tend to point to as like really challenging the way they've thought about things and some of our basic assumptions. So maybe you'll have that reaction. I'd love to hear more about it in class. But I hope you enjoy everything this week. As always, if you need anything, reach out. Have a great week, and I'll see you all later this week.